The bubonic plague left its mark on the human population of Europe, showing that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Medieval people called the catastrophe of the 14th century either the Great Pestilence or the Great Plague. Writers contemporary to the plague referred to the event as the Great Mortality. Swedish and Danish chronicles of the 16th century described the event as black for the first time, likely to refer to black as glum or dreadful, denoting the terror of the events. The German physician Justus Haecker suggested that a mistranslation of the Latin atramors, terrible or black death, had occurred in Scandinavia when he described the Black Death in the 14th century. Black Death became more widely used in the German and English-speaking worlds. The Black Death was a devastating global pandemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. It was spread to Europe by fleas on rats living on trade ships. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost 1/3 of the continent's populations back then. Bubonic plague refers to the painful lymph node swellings called buboes, primarily found around the base of the neck, in the armpits and groin, which oozed pus and bled. Victims underwent damage to the skin and underlying tissue until they were covered in death blotches. Most victims died within 4 to 7 days after infection. When the plague reached Europe, it first struck port cities and then followed the trade routes, both by sea and land. The bubonic plague was the most commonly seen form during the Black Death, with a mortality rate of 30 to 75% and symptoms including fever of 38 to 41 degrees Celsius, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and a general feeling of malaise. Of those who contracted the bubonic plague, 4 out of 5 died within 8 days. The pneumonic plague is an airborne plague that attacks the lungs before the rest of the body. Pneumonic plague was the second most commonly seen form during the Black Death, with a mortality rate of 90 to 95%. The septicemic plague is a form of deadly blood poisoning. The disease is contracted primarily to the bite of an infected insect. Septicemic plague can cause disseminated intravascular coagulation, and it's almost always fatal. The mortality rate in medieval times was 99 to 100%. Septicemic plague is the rarest of the 3 plague varieties. The Plague Doctor costume consisted of an ankle-length overcoat, a bird-like beak masked, filled with sweet or strong-smelling substances, along with gloves and boots. The mask had glass openings for the eyes. Straps held the beak in front of the doctor's nose, which had 2 small nose holes, and was a type of respirator. The beak could hold dried flowers, like roses or carnations, herbs, like mint, spices, camphor, or a vinegar sponge. The purpose of the mask was to remove bad smells, thought to be the principal cause of the disease. Doctors believed the herbs would counter the evil smells of the plague and prevent them from becoming infected. The costume included a wide-brimmed leather hat to indicate their profession. They used wooden canes to point out areas needing attention and to examine patients without touching them. The canes were also used to keep people away and to remove clothing from plague victims without having to touch them. The bubonic plague mechanism was dependent on two populations of rodents, one resistant to the disease, which acts as hosts, keeping the disease endemic, and the second that lacks resistance. When the second population dies, the fleas move on to other hosts, including people, thus creating a human epidemic. The original carrier for the plague-infected fleas thought to be responsible for the Black Death was the black rat. The bacterium responsible for the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, was commonly endemic in only a few rodent species and is usually transmitted zoonotically by the rat flea. Brown rats may suffer from plague, as can many non-rodent species, including dogs, cats, and humans. Some medieval cures and preventive measures for this plague are: plague is a scourge from God for your evil deeds. By scourging yourself with a whip like a flagellant, then God has no reason for scourging you with plague. Apply a mixture of tree resin, roots of white lilies, and human excrements. Bathing should not be avoided and be done with vinegar and rose water, alternatively in your own urine. During the pause of lanced buboes. Quarantine people for 40 days. First done in Venice in 3048. Place a leaf hand close to the swellings to draw out the pestilence, then drink a glass of your own urine twice a day. Grind up an emerald and drink it in wine. Inject snakeskin, bone from the heart of a stag, American clay, precious metals, aloe, myrrh, and saffron. Roast the shells of newly laid eggs and grind them to a powder. Add marigold, flowers, and treacle. Drink in warm beer every morning and night. The eventual weakening of the pandemic was likely due to the practice of quarantining infected people that originated in Venice in the 15th century and is with us to this day. Improved sanitation, personal hygiene, and medical practices also played a role in ultimately slowing the plague's terror march. There are more theories about the end of the Black Plague, but I find it the most reasonable out of all. The wave of deurbanization and its concomitant catastrophes are well evidenced in the art and literature of the day. Probably the most famous literary work of all time, the Decameron by Boccaccio, a collection of medieval tales and folklore, is set in the Italian countryside where aristocrats, fleeing the plague as it ravages Florence, are stranded without their usual entertainments. To pass the time, they tell each other stories from which Boccaccio is said to have harvested a rich storehouse of traditional narrative. The Decameron later served as the foundation for many other Renaissance works, including several of Shakespeare's plays. Little wonder then, so many of his dramas focus on death and the darker side of human life. The visual arts of the day centered even more directly on the consequences of the Black Death. A macabre fascination with death and the process of dying fills painting and statuary from the 14th and 15th centuries. From these have sprung many of the images of death well known today: the Grim Reaper, the Dance of Death, and Albert Dürer's famous etching, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Artists' emphasis on the democratic nature of death, which steals away both rich and poor, nobleman and peasant, pagan and priest, opened the door wide to a general questioning of the culture. Now, a new study, published 19 October 2022 in the journal Nature, shows that the Black Death altered more than society. It also likely altered the evolution of the European people's genome. In the study, Barreiro and his colleagues found that the Black Death survivors in London and Denmark had an edge in their genes, mutation that helped protect against the plague pathogen, Yersinia pestis. Survivors passed those mutations onto their descendants, and many Europeans still carry those mutations today. But that edge comes at a cost. It increases a person's risk of autoimmune diseases. The exact same genetic variant that we find to be protective against Yersinia pestis is associated with an increased risk for Crohn's disease today, Barreiro says. And one other positive result of the bubonic plague was the development of medicine as a science in the West. Whereas in the late Middle Ages, Islamic doctors had for centuries been advocating sensible measures like general cleanliness and the value of studying anatomy, Western healers prior to 1347 were still encumbered by the medieval scorn of the body and ancient medical fallacies, like the theory of humors. But when plague wiped out nearly all the doctors in Europe, just as it had the clergy, physicians, like priests, attended to the dying and because of this were exposed at a higher rate to the more virulent pneumonic form of plague. It precipitated a change in both personnel and precept. Ironically, then, modern Western medicine owes much to Yersinia pestis, one of its most horrifying failures. Also, as the agriculturally oriented manurial system, which had dominated life during the High Middle Ages, slowly failed, industry rose, yet another benefit left in the wake of the Black Death. Once the major impact of the disease was no longer felt, the towns of Europe repopulated faster than smaller communities in the countryside. This new, urbanized Europe paved the way for a society and economy based on different principles, laying the groundwork for modern life, an era when cities, industry, and trade have come to predominate over farming and living in the country. The effects of the Black Death were many and varied. Trade suffered for a time, and wars were temporarily abandoned. Many laborers died, which devastated families through lost means of survival and caused personal suffering. Landowners who used laborers as tenant farmers were also affected. The bubonic plague wiped out tens of millions of people in Europe in the 14th century, gaining the grim label the Black Death. In 2024, a handful of cases arise each year in the United States and around the world, though the disease is far less common and far more treatable.